All right, so today we have our monthly check-in with my friend Paco Nathan on interesting topics touching on AI and the broader tech community. And as many of you know, Paco is the founder of Derwin, a boutique consultancy focused on data and AI. And more importantly, he is principal developer relations engineer at Sensing, where he works on graph AI and graph intelligence. And for many of you who are following this interesting new development called GraphRag, Paco is one of the leading voices and proponents and evangelists for this topic. So Paco, welcome back to our regular check-in.
Thank you, Ben. Good to be here.
All right, so we're recording this in early January. This will air on January 23rd, 3 days after the new administration takes over in the US. So I'll open with a few kind of public policy topics. The first is immigration reform. And I have to say, it was not on my bingo card to think that we would finally get H-1B reform and possibly reform on how we award green cards as well. But, this is all up in the air. But obviously, the mindset and thinking was, okay, so this is dead on arrival when it comes to this new administration. But I think the bright spot of having a lot of people in tech advising the new administration is maybe finally we'll get to H-1B visa reform, which Paco and I have known many friends who have been in the crosshairs of this rule.
Yeah.
And I personally have written many letters in support of people's green cards. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. So I guess I'll start out by just kind of saying that, I am a proponent for the H-1B visa and expanding it. I'm even a proponent of awarding green cards to people who graduate from U.S. universities, especially master's, PhDs in the hard sciences and tech. But I think if I were a betting person, Paco, I think we will get some, not all. But that's better than I think if without the tech advisors, it might have been a complete reversal. But I think actually
Right.
we'll get more
Yeah.
in this direction. What's your sense of how this will play out?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I've written plenty of those letters. Also, child of an immigrant who went to grad school here in the US.
Yeah. I
Near and dear to my
personally have
heart.
gone through this process, so I know how painful it is. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that you said it was not on your bingo card. That was one of the biggest surprises, finding myself agreeing with the tech advisors to the new administration on this point, by and large. So yeah, it's quite a change from what the clamor of the party groundswell had been.
So
Fighting against all immigration.
what's
But
your sense if you were a betting person?
I think that there's enough commercial needs that necessitate easing up, especially on the rhetoric on immigration, but certainly on the formalization in terms of H-1B and others, and green card status. I think that there's enough powers that be that are just going to insist. So I would say, yeah, we probably don't get everything, but I think we probably get a better environment.
Yeah, and I think actually, if you look at, so I did some back of the envelope calculation. If you look at the moonshot projects historically in the US, moon landing, Manhattan Project in World
Yeah.
War II. I mean, I think Manhattan Project, conservatively, maybe a quarter of the people involved were foreign born.
Yeah.
And I think I would be shocked if that number isn't higher for the leading AI labs in the US being foreign born, or probably much higher than 25%. So I think it's actually in our best interest to attract people. And once they go to grad school here, and they are clearly skilled and ready to contribute and work in these labs. Why make the process so painful? It is so painful, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I will say more of the letters that I'm writing lately are for immigration, are are for people who are looking to leave the U.S. and need recommendation letters to get visas elsewhere,
Yeah.
which is maybe not the best turn. So yeah, flip sides of that coin. I
All
think
right.
we're starting to see some brain drain, and that's one thing we want to reverse.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, there's the arguments against uh, expanding the H-1B visa, but I think my, I'm of the position that overall it's a good thing. And obviously, any program will have abusers. I mean, that's just the nature of any rule or policy or government program, right? So, but I think net, this is a benefit.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So my next topic that I wanted to raise in conjunction with the change in an administration is yeah, so this will be interesting to see how it plays out, Paco. So on the one hand, you have the EU AI Act,
Mm.
uh, but then the even the Biden administration and actually the outgoing head of the DHS, Mayorkas, has kind of gone on record as saying the Europeans may be going too far in terms of regulating AI. So that's the Biden people. Now you got the Trump administration coming in. They're definitely more for deregulation. So I don't know. I don't have a sense of how this will play out, but obviously there will be some haggling going on between the Europeans and the new American administration in terms of, are you folks going to go after U.S. companies unnecessarily? And this new administration is going to be very unpredictable. So on the one hand, actually, I think this might be a net positive for the Europeans because you're starting to hear European startups that are thriving, that are moving to the US because of the much more heavily regulated nature of AI in Europe, right? So especially the ones that are starting to get traction and scale. I'm hearing more and more of them moving to SF in particular. So it'll be interesting to see. Uh, yeah, what the haggling will be between these two uh, parties, right? So, because obviously, at the end of the day, the U.S. Competes in AI mainly against China, but so, uh, but on the other hand, the new president being who he is a kind of an unpredictable actor. So
Yeah,
there might be
yeah,
some tying of this regulation to other things, let's say NATO.
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, one thing that I'm hearing more is companies which, the team might have started in Europe, but they organize the company and the funding in the US, but they don't move here. They actually stay in Europe. Eventually, maybe they'll have an office or share a space in an office. They have a charter and they pay US taxes. But the people enjoy the benefits of living in Europe. I've seen this replicated in tech multiple times. And it's kind of a signal that I'm getting out of, companies that I'm advising. Um, so I think that's one trend. I also know people who were charged by EU to analyze the EU AI legislation, do some formal analysis of it. And the takeaways were it's so vague, basically, any point has to be adjudicated. You could make it say everything or nothing, pretty much. In contrast to like GDPR, which was actually very clear and I think was overall a net boost to tech companies in Europe. The AI Act is just vague and suffers a lot of the problems that we discussed about, the Senate bill in California, which also was vague and just had gaping holes and probably could have been used by the wrong parties to argue again anything or nothing. So yeah, I'm worried about what kind of holes that opens up when it comes to negotiating with the new administration.
Yeah, and obviously in the U.S. we're going to have like a probably fragmentation, right? So Colorado has an AI Act coming online. Uh, I think the new Trump administration is probably going to be much more on the uh, deregulation side of the fence, but obviously that's at the federal level. So at the state level, uh, historically, what companies have done is always kind of uh, optimize, or not optimize, but basically organize around what is the strictest regulation we have to contend with, and we organize around that, because otherwise we end up complying with a bunch of with 50 things, right? So
Right. Yeah.
basically
Depends
identify
on
what's the
traffic.
strictest thing, and then we just organize ourselves around that, and then since that's the strictest, that covers us for everything. So, and yeah, I think that next year, actually, my prediction in this coming year in July, not July, but in 2025 in general, is that legal sign-off will be much more of a thing than it
Mhm.
was in 23 or 24, right? So
Yeah, that makes
meaning
sense.
uh, meaning before you deploy AI, you might have to have some sort of legal sign-off, just because some of these rules will start coming in place, which is bodes well for what uh, myself and the folks at Luminous have been arguing for, which is this alignment platform, right? So
Yeah.
needing a place where all these different teams can collaborate, legal, product, technical, and so on. Right now, they are basically collaborating at the level of spreadsheets and Google Docs, and it's a mess, right? So,
Yeah.
and that process doesn't scale when you have many different frameworks of compliance to pay attention to. And so, yeah, so this year, I think um, regulations will start becoming a thing to the point that you will probably need legal sign off.
It's getting complex. I mean, the other signal that I'm hearing, I can't attribute this publicly, but definitely have been in these conversations. Um, on the surface, the new administration wants deregulation, and there's a patchwork brewing of state level compliance, which is difficult to navigate and haphazard. But then behind the scenes, what you're hearing is a different story. Use this particular model from a set of companies that happen to be closely tied with the tech advisors for the new administration. So I mean that started happening about 2 weeks after the election, was basically getting congressional pressure to put in the new backers. Um, and I think that's a lot of what we'll see is just some mess on the surface, but then some back channel that's pushing for a particular monopoly.
Yeah, which actually hits at another topic I wanted to bring up, which is this broader uh, topic of deregulation, which I'm actually in favor of deregulation, because I think the Biden administration was a bit heavy-handed at times. Um, but I think the hope is that deregulation will be even-handed, as you alluded to, right? So in other words, let's not favor certain companies or target certain rivals, right? So let's have, if we're gonna have deregulation, let's make sure that it's smart and doesn't compromise on safety, right? So one of the early signs that is a bit uh, not good, as far as I'm concerned,
Yeah.
is this notion that the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration should stop gathering kind of data around self-driving cars, right? So, and it's particularly accidents and things like that. So I think that doesn't bode well, because basically, like I said, so deregulation should be even-handed and should not uh, compromise safety, especially when it comes to things like that, right? So, uh, vehicles that are out there driving the streets, right? So let the kind of the experienced regulators, assuming that, and it's fine that you can revisit their processes and make sure that they're not overreaching, but let's not favor certain companies or target certain companies. That's my. Let me get off my soapbox now.
Well, I mean, this is purely anecdotal, but I've had the experience with family very recently. People who had never been to San Francisco before, driving around and compare contrast between Uber in a Tesla versus a Waymo, and just the consensus was people feel a lot safer in the Waymo. So I think there's something to be said for a very well structured program and a lot of oversight and a lot of careful statistical accountability of how self-driving cars are happening. I think Waymo's doing this well. Yeah, this scares the living daylights out of me.
Yeah, and yeah, hopefully that, like I said, we can use some deregulation, but let's make sure that it doesn't favor certain companies. All right, so the next topic I wanted to kind of revisit, and I confess, Paco, I may sound like a broken record on this topic, but AI hardware diversification, right? So let me come out and say that
Great.
2025 NVIDIA will still be king. That's guaranteed. That's a given, and probably for the foreseeable future, right? So you've heard me talk about here somewhat positively about AMD and their software stack ROCm, right? So, but I think that, and I think that there are some teams who've gotten AMD and ROCm to work, especially for inference. Some have even gotten it for training. But there have been recent analyses that show that it's just much harder. So in other words, if you take NVIDIA's hardware and AMD's hardware, right? So both companies will say, these are our numbers. These are the benchmarks that you can get when you run these models. If you take NVIDIA's numbers, you download their code, run it, you'll get close out of the box, right? AMD, not so much. I mean, it'll take you a lot of work to get there. And yeah, so then I think that there's a lot of work still left on that software stack. And I think AMD is aware of that. But so is NVIDIA. So it's not like NVIDIA's not innovating. Um, so the areas where, and let me be clear, I think AMD software will get better. But this is a moving target. Things are all, the space is moving fast. So let's see if they can really make a dent on usability this year, right? And I mean, obviously there's ASICs like Cerebras who are really published really great numbers, and people are happy with Cerebras, but it is, it's still somewhat of a niche player, right? So I believe 85% of their revenue is from the UAE, actually. But I mean, it's a real company with real revenue, but it's just not something that you will ever see in a public cloud, right? So the public cloud providers will never install that hardware. So they're more likely to install AMD hardware, but that's assuming you can get it to work, right? So the area where I think we might see a little more progress, although I don't know what the timeline for this will be, is around the axis of energy efficiency. Because there, I think NVIDIA is somewhat vulnerable, and then there's some people who are really kind of making investments and saying that they're going to make a push in this direction. So there's Apple. Obviously, Apple has already replaced Intel CPUs on their laptops. So they're motivated. And I guess they've historically not gotten along with NVIDIA. So maybe Apple will do something on device. ARM, right? So, but That, I mean, just
network
because you say
accelerators.
something, that could take you years to get to something competitive even for inference, right? So, and
Yeah.
then, yeah, and so I think Broadcom is another player that is talking about, uh, AI chips, especially on the efficiency axis. So, yeah, so 2025 will have a little more competition, but NVIDIA will still dominate. And I think a lot of it will rest on whether AMD can really address usability for or improve their software stack. So I don't know what you're hearing in this.
Well, I mean, I think it comes down to like, where are you doing inference as well? Does every organization need to have DSXs? And the answer is no. Are some organizations making nickel off, are they making money off of edge devices? And I think increasingly the answer there is yes. And for that, I think AMD, or sorry, not AMD, ARM has a really good argument. They have a neural network processor on, ARM, and for the embedded kinds of use cases that are workhorses, I think that makes a lot more sense rather than a super high end thing that centralizes and consolidates.
Yeah. And like I said, so there's the investments around the CHIPS Act in the US might pay off, but that's going to be years down the road, right? So, and
Yeah,
also, I
it's increasingly questionable.
yeah,
Yeah.
because a lot of that is really tied to the fate of Intel, which is not 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 in the best shape at the moment.
I
Um,
mean, I think it's good directionally, but I think that like the experiences that we're seeing now about DeepSeek, now with version 3, I think are a very interesting counterpoint to so much of that rhetoric.
all right, actually, which brings me to DeepSeek.
Right.
So I did a deep dive. I don't know if you
Yeah.
saw it, but
Yeah, that's great.
I
Fantastic.
started reading both English and Chinese language coverage, right? So this is the third version of their model. So
Yeah.
actually, this is an interesting company that falls under this whole theme of necessity is the mother of invention, right? So if you don't have access to the latest and greatest chips, you are forced to innovate. And I think, yeah, I don't know why this had to happen in China and not here, but I think probably this is the reason. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So,
Sure.
so here, if you have, if uh, if you have enough money, you can probably get access to the latest and greatest chips, right? So
But then there are inefficiencies because you have all that capital up front. Yeah.
yeah. So a couple of things about DeepSeek, right? One, they're committed to some sort of openness. I hate using the word open source for these things, right? So let's just say open weights.
Yeah.
When Paco and I say open source on this podcast, when it comes to these models, we probably mean open weights, right? So, um, and then they're also very committed to resource conscious uh,
Right.
systems, right? So basically, I think a combination of, they want to make sure that whatever they build is efficient for inference, but also they want to be efficient when they train these models. Um, and then they're also kind of like open AI in that their holy grail is AGI. But they also want to run a lean operation, right? So
Got it.
what has happened with version 3? So version 3, I think there was a lot of hype. I think it's a good model, but is it the greatest model? No, right? So
Hmm.
it's not going to be as good as uh, I think a lot of these models, and we've discussed this, Paco, right? So when they release, here we are with the benchmarks, we beat everyone. But when you start using them, you probably end up using the other models most of the time. You'll probably use this when, yeah, it just basically comes down to your use case. You have to try it, right? So I found that it's not a complete replacement to the latest Gemini, the latest OpenAI, the latest Claude, right? So, or even the late, I guess maybe Llama, it could probably, because Llama hasn't been updated in a while, right? Um, so there's a lot, they've made a lot of innovations on the architecture side that I'm not going to discuss, but the two things that are probably worth noting is, multi-head latent attention, right? So that's something that other teams are excited about and probably will emulate. But more importantly, scaling inference, right? So they've been able to do a lot of innovation, not just on the fact that they're training these models for cheap. I mean, ridiculously cheap, right? So I mean, I think in the single digit millions, is
I,
what they're claiming, right?
yeah, I
Uh,
was going to ask about price tag. I think that we've seen reports of like 5.6 million.
yeah. Oh yeah. So then the other innovation on the architecture side, which is worth noting, which drives down the inference cost, is mixture of experts, which a lot of teams actually do, but they make a concerted effort
They're
around
really
this
pushing.
specifically.
How about the
Um,
impact of speculative decoding for inference?
Yeah, I think it's mostly around the mixture of experts, right? Because basically they can definitely take a large model and at inference make sure that they don't really need the entire model, right?
Enormous, yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, so the question is, will other teams take what they've done? And so here's the thing, right? So they're not it's called open source, but it's
It's
really
up and weight.
not completely open source, right? So, but
Yeah.
they do share, um, let's see, training recipes, right? So, but not the full training or serving code.
Not the full training. Yeah.
But it seems like, yeah. So at some point, you would imagine the teams out here even will start trying to prioritize innovation around efficiency. I think they are, but they're not as desperate as the teams in China who don't have access to the latest hardware, right? So when you're in that position, you're a lot more pressed, right? So here, okay, so you might say, I have 100-person research team. Let's carve out 10 or 20 of them to focus on this topic. Whereas there, it might be, well, we have no choice. All 100 of us have to work. Whatever we do, we have to factor in this notion that we gotta be inventive and
Mhm.
resourceful, right? So, um, yeah. So I don't know. So have you? So I've actually tried DeepSeek, but I haven't. I'm not at the. I'm not. I don't think that is like I said, a replacement to the proprietary models. I can see it replacing Llama at times in what I do, but I don't think I can throw away Gemini, Claude, or the latest OpenAI models.
I mean, the thing that really strikes me is that you talk to venture capital investors and they're all about efficiency of capital, and until you start talking about like large language model projects, and then that argument seems to go out the window. But here, I mean, yeah, they like you said, single digit investment, millions investment, like $6 million, comparable, getting comparable with models that say have had three orders of magnitude more investment. And so the question is, I mean, if you're an enterprise organization, could you peel off $5 or $6 million and 20 people to do a project? The answer is yeah, thousands of organizations can do that. Could you peel off $6 billion to do a project? No, only a handful of companies can do that. So I think that that's something that a lot of investors should look at, because when you go out and talk with, say, some of the pharma companies that are really making return on investment with LLM projects, again, they're not necessarily boiling the ocean. They're not using enormous models. They're working with more purpose-built, more constrained data. They own that data. Nobody else has access to it. And they can work with models that are on the order of this and budgets that are on the order of this and get return on investment. So I think that's something that both the VC community and the enterprise community should be looking at.
And they also, I think, the fact that they have to be resourceful by force, by default, necessity, right? Uh, on the training side, and then they kind of carry that over to the inference side. Yeah, it's just something that, so here, because basically here, it seems like the top AI labs that compete with each other, they're all going after AGI. And so they want to build the best model, and so it's DeepSeek, right? So, but it just happens DeepSeek is in a location where they don't have access to the latest hardware, right? So here then I think, yeah, it's at some point at some point, you also need to factor in the fact that whatever we do, even though we're competing with people who have unlimited resources, Meta and Google, we we might be able to outcompete them if we can produce models on par with them, but are cheaper to operate because people will use us, right? So that's one dimension that, but even X.AI built, I think, one of the largest clusters of the latest NVIDIA hardware in the world, right? I mean, Elon basically has standing order with NVIDIA for lots and lots of chips, right? So I think even the startups here are kind of operating under the assumption we need to, you know, we're competing with other teams that are buying up this hardware. We have to buy up all that hardware. And then on the other hand, you have this team that can't buy that hardware that may not produce the top model, but is maybe top 10, right? So,
Yeah, and again, if it's what you need to get the job done, I mean, certainly there are going to be use cases that are say scientific use cases that are much more aligned with having a very large cluster and having the highest end possible. I hear that, but there's a lot of other use cases that are probably going to be more along the lines of what can I run inference on board a drone or in factory automation and robotics. These are more kind of the edge implementations that have real economic value. And there the large cluster doesn't buy you anything.
which, by the way, to their defense, all the proprietary model, foundation model creators have essentially what they call their flash mini versions of their
Right.
model,
Yeah. Each
which are
one.
fast
Yeah.
and cheap and things like that, right? So, but on the training side, yeah, they may need to also prioritize inventiveness there. But like I said, necessity is the mother of inventions, right? So,
I,
so
I,
we
I,
we see that in the war in Ukraine, right? So you
yeah.
had no drone industry to probably now the best drone industry, one of the best drone sectors in Europe, if not the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting what you were saying too. The majors tend to have the smaller models. It's also on the open weight models. This is where a lot of the innovation happens. I mean, I've seen a lot done with like Microsoft's V3 Mini, and other organizations. There's diversity of what people can do when they go out and train with their own data or do their own fine tuning. Um, so yeah, does the innovation necessarily happen at the most well-funded? I think that's probably the question to be asking, and I think that DeepSeek is providing existence proof for saying no.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on. I think if you want to go to the if you want to build the best model, yep, probably. I don't think DeepSeek is that, but what they've shown is that you can build something decent and competitive at a fraction of the cost, which begs the question: if anything, these other foundation models creators should carve out teams that mimic this philosophy so that they can move faster, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
certainly.
yeah. All right. So my next topic is actually related to this, which is around these reasoning enhanced models that, I guess, OpenAI o1 model kind of pioneered. Um, so uh, the thing about these models is that the inference is a lot slower, right? Because if any of our listeners have used any of these models, they think, but the thinking consumes compute, right? So whatever the thinking might be, I wrote a post where I kind of went through a paper that tried to kind of reverse engineer what O1 is doing, right? So there might be some sort of Monte Carlo tree search going on there. Search is kind of a mimic for thinking, but in any case, so there's some additional compute that happens at inference, which brings me to this topic for 2025 that you all should pay attention to, which is this phrase inference scaling is going to be a thing, right? So, because basically
Certainly.
these reasoning enhanced models will become a lot more compute intensive on the inference side. I mean, these reasoning enhanced models will be much more compute intensive on the inference sides, which begs the question, if you're a team, how do we make sure that we can scale inference in the world of these types of models, right? So whatever we did before may or may not work anymore, right? So, and actually, I'm kind of reading between the lines, but the chips that NVIDIA has kind of pre-announced for their conference this year, if you read through the specs, you can, I can see why at this conference they can announce, hey, these chips are great for inference scaling in the world of reasoning enhanced models, right? So these chips will have extra oomph for this world of reasoning enhanced models, right? And by the way, so O1 obviously pioneered this, but Gemini has it now, the latest Gemini 2.0, which is preview. And I expect the next Llama will have it. The next cloud will have some sort of uh, uh, capability around reasoning, right? So in the context of this discussion, reasoning here just means kind of the ability to do kind of iterative problem solving, right? So where that's why there's some sort of thinking process going on if you use GPT-o1, for example, right? Um, yeah, inference scaling is going to be a buzzword, I predict in 2025. Uh, so anyway,
Yeah,
so
I
what's your
agree.
sense so I don't know to what extent have you been using these reasoning enhanced models, but they they're not, so there's certain things they're much better at, but there's certain things where they might have taken a step back, like coding, for example, right? So if your job is coding, then some of the non-reasoning models for now might be better. But by the way, so we're having this discussion early January. In late December, OpenAI did not release, but kind of announced their O3 model. They skipped O2 in respect to the British company
The
O2.
trademark, right?
Yeah. So they went from O1 to O3. But the O3 model basically uh, did super well on some really hard benchmarks without any tuning. So for what it's worth, right? So, but that's a preview, right? So that we haven't gotten our hands on it, right? So, but O1, I use O1 quite a bit. Not completely abandoned non O1 OpenAI models, and but it's pretty good at certain things, and I expect And like I said, the latest Gemini also seems to exhibit good reasoning capability. Although the preview version of Gemini 2.0 is the Flash mini version, so we'll see how. So I think the exact comparison there will be O1 mini would be the exact comparison, but yeah. So yeah,
I'm
so it's not like so we really need nuclear fusion, Paco.
I have
Because
questions. Yeah,
now
I,
inference will be also computationally intensive, right? So,
I I have real questions. I mean, when it comes to LLM for reasoning and scaling inference and all of this, I am wondering what the return on investment will be, taking a look at carbon footprint, energy costs, etc. I'm not sure that we're really going to be getting the bang for the buck out of it. I mean, in terms of going back a few decades in AI, the notion of solvers and planners and schedulers has been crucial. It was recognized as being crucial. That definitely took a back seat the moment that people were looking at deep learning models. But there are hybrid systems which are beginning to use planners and solvers internally. So I think that an interesting counterpoint, and maybe currently all it is just counterpoint and very much a research topic, but I think it's worth taking a look at like large concept models, and related to that, topics like graph reader and topics like, oh, where was I? Let me dig my notes up. Graph language models. All of them have a notion of leveraging essentially what would have been called a blackboard architecture years ago. But the idea is that you're using models to put together larger sets of facts, not just sequences of tokens, but larger conceptual, interrelated, graphy kinds of things, and then doing inference off that. Because there's a much larger body, there's a much larger bench of how to do really interesting and effective reasoning once you're in that space. And the idea is that if you have a planner, if you have solvers that you can leverage, then your internal Blackboard can also be optimized with those planners. That was something going back to like Hearsay 2. And I mean, that's going back 50 years ago. So I think that we're kind of reinventing the wheel here a bit. My own bias is that I think that a lot of the tokenization strategies threw the baby out with the bathwater by having very simplistic subword tokenization. I think that looking at like conceptual tokenization is a pretty interesting thing. And I think that that buys you much more efficient and effective reasoning than some of these directions. But
yeah,
I'm biased.
I think they're actually not mutually exclusive. I think
Yeah, neurosymbolic
you'll
approaches.
see
Yeah,
them all combined, right? So yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I think actually the only reason I'm somewhat uh, um, positive about this is just because I've used O1 enough to know that there's some value there. And
yeah.
given the fact that O3 performed so well on these benchmarks without any tuning, but I'm taking their word on this, right? So that basically they just took O1 fresh off training and then boom, it just did so well on these benchmarks. Um, Assuming that that's the case, right? So, and I know that other teams are looking uh, at this direction as well. That
Yeah.
I think that this is going to be a yeah. So reasoning enhanced models will be a thing in 25, and as an artifact of that, inference scaling will be an important issue in 25. Yeah.
Definitely.
Um, and I guess my very last topic is basically just uh, multimodal models very quickly.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think the visual language models seem to be interesting. Uh, the models that now we're starting to use are increasingly multimodal anyway. At least the proprietary models are multimodal. From OpenAI and Gemini in particular. Um, and so I think that 25 might be the year where the end user consumer, not developer, might be interacting with models that are increasingly more multimodal instead of uh, Yeah, so the one thing that OpenAI has really done is here's an interface and use the model. Whereas with Google, they have a lot of good models, but it's all over the map, man. Some are in Gemini, some in Vertex,
Yeah,
right? Some in what is it called? The AI Studio, right? So yeah, I think that if Google can somewhat consolidate the interface into one, then it's not so confusing for the end user, right? So, because now I think Google is getting models that are going to be very attractive to regular people as well. They were dismissed, the first few models of Google. But I think that if they can just, yeah, I don't know why they have so many, you know, just here's a place, here's the model, right? So, and then maybe there's a drop down menu. You can choose what model you're going to use, but here's the interface, right? So,
definitely not a top-down control structure there. Um, Yeah, no, I mean, multimodal is doing heavy lifting. I think that this is so important. You go out into enterprise and you quickly find that there's so much appetite to be doing something interesting in multimodal, because there's typically like a 4-to-1 ratio of unstructured data versus structured data. And a lot of the unstructured data is really important. I mean, diagrams, relatively unstructured, right? But diagrams are important for compliance and important for troubleshooting and maintenance and these kinds of things that are very real. And I think that these areas also, the flip side of more of a multimodal world is, where does diffusion come into play? I mean, can we get diffusion of architectural diagrams? Can we get diffusion of other kinds of semi-structured things that aren't text, and aren't just some generated image? Um, so yeah, I think this is a really really interesting topic. Are the multimodal models? I guess the question is, are we seeing multimodal models training which aren't just a matter of here's a text caption for an image? I mean, that's kind of the cheap hack.
so I
Um,
think that yeah, so I think that the early manifestations will be just simple tasks on multimodal data. Because I think we still need to get to multimodal understanding, right? So on text, I think we've made a lot of progress on NLU, natural language understanding, but multimodal visual understanding, I think there's still some innovation that needs to be done there at the model level, right? So that means, here's a 2-hour video, upload it, and then the model will actually understand what's happening in the video. Right now, I think uh, I think it's if there's a lot of spoken dialogue in the video, then the transcript will lead to a lot of understanding. But as you and I know, Paco, and the listeners know, I mean, in the video, there's so many non-text things that are happening that are interesting, right? So that
yeah.
a human watching a piece of video will know a lot of things happening without any dialogue, right? So, uh, and so we need to get to that point with some of these models, the true visual understanding. And sure, maybe if there's a slide in the video that can be OCR, then that can be turned into text and understood. But I mean, there's a lot of non-text information in a video that also may not require audio, you know?
I mean, I think it goes beyond it too when you look into scientific applications. I mean, I think that there's a lot of room forward in material science and impact of AI on working with material science. The Le Material project by Anthropic is interesting. Basically, taking materials and being able to come up with a unique digital fingerprint, which you can then use for vectorization. Um, can you do some kind of graph isomorphism on the molecular structure, the crystal structure, and then you don't have to describe it in text, right? You actually have a vector. So I think that as we see.
That seems a lot easier than visual understanding of video, though.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think that there's a
You know,
lot of bang
I
for the
mean,
buck on it too. I mean,
uh,
I think when it comes to like
look
chemistry and
look at
physics,
all the things I'm doing right now, how do you
yeah.
describe it, right?
Well, I mean, I think that this is where we'll see, at least near term, we'll see a lot of benefit out of multimodal is again, this kind of thing, especially in industrial environments or science that benefits from industrial environments, batteries, photovoltaic cells, nuclear fusion, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. All right, so quick recommendations. I have a couple. Um, One is a book called The House of Huawei by a Washington Post tech reporter, Eva Dow.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So Huawei obviously is a global player in telecoms, but I think telecom infrastructure, but also mobile phones, and also in China, semiconductors, right? So that go into the mobile phones. So and having done consulting for Huawei way back in the day, so just in case Trump administration is listening, all this consulting work happened in the before times when everyone was consulting for Huawei.
Not me, not me.
Uh, and so yeah, so it's a fascinating read, and it kind of tracks a lot of uh, how I perceive the culture. And then
Interesting.
but the other recommendation I have is related. It's a Wall Street Journal article, how Chinese hackers graduated from clumsy corporate thieves to military weapons. So
Mm,
basically, talks about how their cyber capabilities have evolved from basically amateurish to increasingly very sophisticated
yeah.
uh, efforts that have been kind of co-opted by the military industrial complex in China.
Uh, for recommendations,
Yeah.
so in December, I spent a lot of December in the UK, around London especially, and we had some alumni reunions kind of ad hoc. One of them was Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, was giving a talk about his new book, Super Agency, and a bunch of us who were studying AI at Stanford back then got together and started talking. So I'll give a recommendation to an old friend of mine who's a professor at Sussex in both computer science, AI, and in philosophy. His name is Ron Chrisley. And the thing is that a lot of the discussions we were having while I was over there amongst this crowd were really formal exploration of consciousness. I think that there's a lot of talk about AGI and what does it mean to have machine consciousness, and so much of that is just it's very simplistic. It's the kind of thing that any reasonable philosophy professor could eviscerate within about 30 seconds. But talking with these folks is really interesting because they came out with, I mean, there's a lot of debate if you go into Dennett or go into, I don't know, Frankish or some of these other, well-known writers on the subject. What is consciousness? What are some formal definitions? How can you dispute specious claims? There's some really interesting arguments, and I liked that this set of professors was boiling it down into talks where the discussions and the definitions were relatively simple. The kind of thing is approachable just by everyday people. I think that's a great counterpoint to a lot of the speciousness that's coming out of AGI or superintelligence or whatever you want to say. So I think that this kind of work really belongs in the realm of philosophy professors more so than Silicon Valley product managers. But that's just me. But I will definitely point to Ron Chrisley and some of his publications, and also Aaron Sloman and others who've been looking at this problem and basically saying, okay, we can shoot down a lot of claims, but we can also make affordances for the possibility long term of machine consciousness. What would that entail? What would it necessitate? And the current level of LLMs clearly is not that, admitting for the possibility and understanding and arguing about it formally.
I guess this line of thinking is not my jam because I think of these things as tools. But on the other hand, one thing along these lines, Paco, that surprises me is the number of people I come across who literally talk to these models as if they're friends. And then
Yeah.
they're not, they're sophisticated people. I mean, they're tech savvy people who just, tired at the end of the day, go home and chat to one of these models. Right? I
It's the
mean,
script. It's the script for the movie Her. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, this is happening. I mean, it's not made up, right? So people are doing this. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I'm not doing it, but there are people who are already doing it now.
I mean, to be clear, I would prefer to talk about cognition because there are formal definitions for that, and we can talk about
Yeah.
cognition in teams of people and machines together. So I really don't want to talk about consciousness. It's not my area.
Yeah.
But I think that, when you see people kind of going off the deep end and making claims, let's bring in some experts on the topic and pull it apart.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the argument for some liberal arts classes, right?
I'll drink to that.
Yeah. And with that, thank you, Paco.
Thank you, Ben.